which is quite fascinating. Again, just highlighting a few things, which I think is great. Yeah, we grew up in Ohio, got a fine arts degree, and that's all right.
Thanks.
Engineers, and stuff. But decided to become a career in history and received a master's degree in museum and archival management. Worked as a curator and archivist at the Cincinnati Art Museum, so that's no small stuff.
Gee, I didn't know that.
A variety of other museums. When he moved here, he became administrator of the Hiwan Homestead Museum in Evergreen, and became history education supervisor and regional supervisor for the Bear Creek region. So that, it's quite an accomplishment and experienced things there. And as we kind of can see here, John is very interested in the Revolutionary War and has become involved in I guess several, or at least one, reenacting group. Which has helped us.
Several. Yeah. I was stricken with that disease about 45 years ago, but I'm too old to be doing much of it now. So there it is.
Well, anyway, without further ado, John, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'll get this out of the way.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming out today, but I'm in a terrible dilemma right now. I don't really know how to start this talk because I was going to start it by insulting Bob Mulder, but he's not here. I can't do that. How can I do this program? So I guess what I'll do is just plunge right into it. Okay, let's go. It's 1783. The Revolutionary War is over. The peace treaty has been signed. George Washington has resigned his commission, has ridden home to Mount Vernon. He's there by Christmas to be there with Martha and the stepkids. Everybody's happy. Bells are ringing. Fireworks are going off. People are illuminating their windows with candles. Banquets are being held. Probably in those four-poster beds, people are making whoopee, but we won't go into that. And everybody is happy except those 110,000 loyalists who fled to Canada or England and had remained loyal to King George. Everybody's happy. Everything's coming up roses. And one of the reasons is we got a lot of concessions from the British, from the peace commissioners, which included John Jay, John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Ben Franklin's nephew, whose name I can't remember. And they were able to get a lot of concessions. And by the way, this painting was done by Benjamin West, the American artist who lived in England. And he had started it with the American commissioners. The British commissioners were humiliated by this defeat in the Revolutionary War, and they refused to sit for the portrait. So that's why their side of it is empty. That's an emblem of how overwhelming this victory was for the United States. And if you look at the map, now one of the startling things to people, I think, when you look at this is check out everything that's controlled by Spain. Everything from the Mississippi River all the way out to the west coast of what's now the United States is Spanish territory. Here's the United States as it ended up, extending now from the Appalachian Mountains out to the Mississippi River. That's the area that was ceded to us by the British after the Revolutionary War. And there had been a demand at the peace talks that this area would be an Indian buffer state, that this would be Indian country, that the Indian tribes would stay where they were, and this would be a perpetual area reserved for them. But the United States commissioners would not accept that, and so it became part of the United States. So that's kind of our status on the continent as we move into the post-war period. But everybody's happy, right? Well, some people are not, because in Congress there was a sudden realization. All of a sudden we have this incredibly huge territory from the Appalachian Mountains out to the Mississippi River, hundreds of millions of acres. How are we going to create control? How are we going to gain control of this area, impress upon the Indians that we do control it, and prevent crime and other, land theft and all kinds of other things from happening in that area. Well, we're going to have an armed force to do that. The Continental Army was disbanded, except for 80 men. 80 men were the entire United States regular Army force, 55 at West Point and 35 at Fort Pitt. So we don't have any kind of armed regular force. So what do? Congress authorizes the recruiting, supplying, uniforming, equipping of 700 men to become the new United States Army. The old Continental Army is gone from the Revolutionary War. Now we have a new United States Army. Of that 700 men that are authorized, these men are supposed to be recruited by and supplied by the individual states, where only 2 states respond, Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And we end up, instead of those 700 men that are authorized to be in the Army, we end up with about 260. And the commander becomes Colonel Josiah Harmar, who was a very well-respected Army officer during the Revolutionary War in the Pennsylvania line in the Continental Army. He was so trusted that he was the guy that they authorized to bring the peace treaty from Paris to the United States so it could be authorized. So this is the guy that everybody trusts and has faith in, and they make him the colonel of these 260 men, and in the spring of 1784, they march out of Philadelphia to take control of this entire area between the Allegheny Mountains, the Appalachians, and the Mississippi River, 260 men. And what he does with them is pretty impressive, because they build a whole string of forts all the way from the area around Pittsburgh down the Ohio River. This is Fort Harmar, which is at the confluence of the Muskingum and the Ohio rivers at present-day Marietta, Ohio. And they build a whole string of forts from Pittsburgh all the way down the Ohio River to Louisville, and then all the way up to Vincennes, Indiana, to maintain some control over these areas in that region. So that's a pretty impressive accomplishment. Yes, sir?
John, if you only have, 260 men?
Yeah.
When he builds a fort, how does he keep a man?
Well, he has to drop off people at each fort as he goes down the river. So now, as the first year, now those original men were only enlisted for a year. Okay, and things changed because somebody in Congress, a bulb lit up, and they said to themselves, what happens when those one-year enlistments are up? We're not going to have anybody in the Army. So we're going to enlist people from now on for 3 years. So they build up the armed force that way. They recruit more men, and they enlist them for longer enlistments. So that's how he's able to do that. He's building up slowly but surely some kind of regular force for the United States Army, without a whole lot of help from the government. Now, who are these guys in the Army? Some of them are veterans of the Revolutionary War who are used to Army life, but the majority of them are either German or Irish immigrants who are right off the boat. They have no jobs, they have no acquaintances in the United States. How am I going to survive, provide for myself? I'm going to join the Army. So about 60% of the men in the Army are either German or Irish immigrants. They had one company, Captain Ziegler's company, that was all Germans, and many of them had served in the various armies, the different principalities within what we now call Germany. So a lot of them were very experienced soldiers, and that's going to pay off in the future, as I will say. Trouble in paradise. Uh-oh. So here's what's happening. The British put trade restrictions in revenge on our trade and commerce with the islands in the West Indies. And that had been a big mainstay, especially in the New England states, of their commerce. Ships are sitting idle at the docks. Sailors are all out of work. It's a terrible situation. The state government in Massachusetts is trying to pay off the state debt from the Revolutionary War, putting heavy taxes on people. The farmers in western Massachusetts get enraged by this. They stage an armed rebellion, which is led by a man named Daniel Shays. This is 1786. and they actually attack and try to take over the federal arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts, which they are repelled by the loyal, if you want to call it that, state militia. So there's armed rebellion against a state government. The various state governments are raising trade barriers and tariffs against each other. If you're in Delaware, you want to sell your corn in Philadelphia, right across the river. You cross the river, you have to pay a tariff to the officials in Pennsylvania. So we have then the Spanish are restricting commerce from Kentucky and Tennessee down the Mississippi River. So that's a problem. The British are still occupying all their forts along the northern border of the United States. Fort Niagara, Fort Detroit, Fort Mackinac, Fort Presque Isle. These are all still occupied by British troops on American soil. And what the British are saying is, you never fulfilled all the terms of the treaty that we signed in 1783, so we're going to keep occupying these forts until you do. And of course, Canada is British territory. So there's that big threat from the north. The Spanish also occupy forts in what's supposed to be the United States, but nobody's quite sure of that boundary yet. So here's what we have. We have foreign troops on our southern and our northern border occupying forts on our territory. We have trade barriers among the different states. All the political power is with the states. The central government is governed by a document called the Articles of Confederation. And the central government of the United States is extremely weak. There's no executive branch, there's no judicial branch, there's only the legislative branch, Congress. And Congress is considered of so little importance, most of the time they can't even get a quorum. And the state governments, the state politicians like Patrick Henry in Virginia or Sam Adams in Massachusetts are real happy with this. We have all the power, we don't really care. So this is the situation. This is a country that's in trouble and in some ways seems to be disintegrating. Well, some people are concerned enough about it that they come together to create some solutions. In 1787, a group of people get together in Philadelphia at what they call the Constitutional Convention. They're supposed to just modify the Articles of Confederation and make it more workable. And instead, what do? These people get together and they write an entirely new document for the government of the United States, and they call it something like the Constitution of the United States of America. All right, so this has to go through approval by Congress and a long ratification process, but it's a start toward creating a good new government for the United States. And at the same time, Congress is meeting in Philadelphia, and they create the Northwest Territory, the territory northwest of the River Ohio, as it's officially known, and that includes present-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It's a big territory. They create a mechanism of government. They appoint a governor. They create a mechanism for land sales, and they start selling land off to various land companies. This is virtually the only avenue of revenues that the central government has before the Constitution is adopted. So they're kind of trapped into doing this, and there's a lot of what we would call conflict of interest. A lot of congressmen are invested in these different land companies, the Ohio Company, the Scioto Company, the Miami Purchase. So there's a lot of double dealing, underhanded stock being sold, and it's an interesting situation. Now, who's concerned about this? Well, and I should say, after they do this and after the land is sold, new communities are being formed north of the Ohio River. This is Campus Martius, which was the fortified community there along the Muskingum River that became Marietta, Ohio. And then this is Cincinnati, the thriving community of Cincinnati, about 1803 in southwestern Ohio. So these new communities are being created in these areas that are of land sales, the big land companies being catered to by the central government. Okay? Now who's concerned about this? Well, during and after the Revolutionary War, the Indian tribes, the different Indian nations of the Northwest Territory were promised by the government of the United States and by various state governments, there will never be any white settlement north of the Ohio River. Okay, that's not a problem, don't worry about it. Well, guess what? Right after the war, as I mentioned, all these land sales start and millions of acres in what's now Ohio start being sold off and the white settlers start swarming in. And this will give a little bit of an idea. This is a little bit off. The Delaware should be now living over here in southeastern Ohio, but the rest of it is pretty accurate. We have the Delaware over here, we have the Shawnee, the Miamis, the Potawatomis, Ottawa, and Chippewa, the Illinois, and down here in the south, the Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, Cherokees, etc. By this time, the Powhatans are long gone. Anyway, so this will give you an idea where some of the different tribes are located. And they're not happy. Now, this isn't a big problem right at the beginning in 1788 when these new communities are being established. They're small, tiny communities along the river. But as small settlements begin to spread out from those original communities, satellite communities start spreading out into the countryside. The forest is starting to be cleared off for farming. The game is starting to be hunted by these white people. And native resentment builds and builds until about 1789, we have a whole number of attacks by different Indian warriors from these different tribes on these small settlements that surround the original ones. So the conflict begins and it eventually spreads to the point where around Cincinnati, federal troops are being attacked. Okay, and this triggers, there's a red line being crossed there, on not only a few civilians here and there are being attacked, now U.S. Army troops are being attacked. This triggers an all-out war. And Colonel Harmar decides to lead an expedition to the northwest to Kekionga. Kekionga was a whole complex of Indian villages from different tribes located right about where Fort Wayne, Indiana is now. So he leads a force of about 1,400 men to the northwest, building a road as he goes up to Fort Wayne, Indiana area to attack these villages. And supposedly the thought is, this is always the thought when the United States is at war with Indian tribes, we will chastise the savages. Okay, we'll give them a drubbing, we'll defeat them, we'll destroy their village, and then that will force them to come to peace. Of course, not realizing, no, the opposite is going to happen. You destroy their villages, you ravage their crops, they're not going to come to peace with you. They're going to intensify the warfare. And this is exactly what happens. Now, Harmar's success, believe it or not, surprised the Indians. They attack the villages, the Indians flee, and they're able to destroy these communities and ravage the corn and the other crops that are growing in the area and destroy them. So, wow, complete success. Except the militia from Kentucky beg him. The officers come to Harmar and say, look, our militia signed up to fight Indians. We want to fight Indians. So we'll stay behind with a certain number of regular troops and we'll decoy the Indians into an ambush. Right? Now think about this. We're going to sneak up on the Indians. Is this going to work? No. So this force that he leaves behind, about 400 men, are attacked and ambushed by the Indians. The militia, who were so anxious to do fighting with Indians, throw down their guns and run away at about the first shot, leaving the small number of regulars to be cut down, surrounded, and killed. So when Harmar gets back to Cincinnati at Fort Washington, there's an inquiry. He's cleared of really any blame, but he's also discredited. The next year, we have a new campaign led by Governor Arthur St. Clair. General St. Clair is the governor of the Northwest Territory. He was a major general during the Revolutionary War. And he decides to also lead an expedition up from Fort Washington. He's building some forts along the way. Fort Hamilton, that's where I grew up. Fort St. Clair, Fort Jefferson, etc., up to this area here, along the Wabash River. Now, this new expedition, first of all, St. Clair is sick. He has to be carried in a litter. He's not an effective commander. He has 2 regiments of regulars and 2 regiments of 6-month recruits that are called the levies. And he has the militia from Kentucky, who proved so reliable in the last campaign, total about 2,000 men. And they've been cheated by the government contractors. They have tents that don't keep out the rain. They have gunpowder that won't go off. They have cheap uniforms that fall apart. Harmar said later he was amazed that St. Clair would even start out, considering the men and the material that he had. So he was unable to start until late October, so he's struggling north, building his own road, his own trace through the wilderness to go up to, and he gets lost. Where he wants to go is up here. He gets lost, and he's encamped up here along the Wabash River. And on the morning of, and by the way, he also had, along with the troops, he had about 200 camp followers, women and children who were traveling with the army. So on the morning of November 4th, 1791, the shots ring out. There are Indian war cries. The militia has encamped, as usual, they do things really well. They've encamped across the creek from the rest of the army, so St. Clair can't build a fortified defense perimeter. And when the Indians attack, they're able to swarm right into the camp. So the militia run away, and they cluster, and they discombobulate the regular troops as they run, and they cluster in the middle of the camp, useless, trying to get safety. There are different tribes. There's about 1,000 Indian warriors here, led by Little Turtle of the Miami, Blue Jacket of the Shawnee, Baconjahelas of the Delaware, and Igushaway of the Ottawa. And they're veterans. By the way, these guys are veterans of many years of warfare. So they know how to fight this. The Indians surround the camp. They pick off the artillerymen. Almost 90% of the officers are killed. A final bayonet charge clears the way for the army to retreat. They leave behind all their artillery, their cannon, all their supplies, all their food, all their extra gunpowder, weapons. This is all left behind. Nearly 1,000 are killed or wounded. And the Indians call this the Battle of 1,000 Slain. Only about 3 of the camp followers survive. The rest are killed, scalped. One of the retreating soldiers said he saw all these men lying on the ground who'd been scalped, and their heads looked like pumpkins, and they were steaming in the cold November air. So this was the greatest disaster and the worst defeat ever suffered by United States troops at the hands of Native American people. St. Clair's defeat made the Battle of the Little Bighorn look like a Sunday picnic. So in the aftermath of this, both sides are trying to figure out, what do we do? There's a big Indian council held in northwest Ohio, and the chiefs are trying to decide what to do. And reading the proceedings of this, which were written down by one of the British officials, it really gives a window into how eloquent, how well-informed, how intelligent these Indian leaders were, and how experienced in warfare, veterans. So they deputized 2 chiefs to speak for peace and 2 chiefs to speak for war. And the ones who spoke for peace said, look, let's be practical, look at the numbers. Look how heavily the whites outnumber us. We are few compared to them. Eventually they're going to overwhelm us. So now we can negotiate from a position of strength. Let's negotiate with them. Maybe we can allow some white settlement north of the Ohio and compromise. The leaders who spoke for war were also very eloquent. Agushiwe of the Ottawa said, no, do not allow any whites to mingle among you. Don't allow them any of your land, any of it. He said, look to the east, beyond the mountains. He said, that's what happened there. The Indians allowed the whites to gain some land and mingle among them. Where are they now? Where are the Indians in those areas? They're not there. They're gone. So when the whites come in, you give them an inch, they'll take a mile, they'll take your land. Don't let them in. Continue the war. So there were three conclusions. One of the elder chiefs stepped in at the end of this and said, okay, let me summarize. He said, we have one alternative, and that is to petition to the United States government for peace negotiations. Or we could wait for them to make that offer to us. We could continue the war and try to drive all the whites south of the Ohio River, or we could ask the King of England to mediate between us and try to come up with a solution. Those are the three alternatives, but in the meantime, we'll continue the war. Okay. Back in Philadelphia, President Washington, by now, this is 1791, President Washington and the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, are trying to figure out what to do. Obviously, the Army needs to be rebuilt, reorganized, and a new leader. Congress also realizes that for the first time. Maybe they're showing some common sense. And they authorize the recruiting, equipping, paying of 5,120 men for the U.S. Army. Why 5,120 men? Why that exact number? Do you know, Dave Jamiel? No? 5,120.
120 officers?
What's that?
120 officers?
No. No.
Per state?
No. That's the exact number of men that was in an ancient Roman legion. That's why they chose 5,120. Because what? Our whole American Republic goes back, our model is the ancient Roman Republic in its early days before they became corrupt. Our model, we even took our emblem, the eagle, from the ancient Roman Republic. And so 5,120 men, and they're going to be well-trained, well-disciplined, long-term enlistment, well-equipped, well-led soldiers. They're not going to be raw, disorganized militia. They're not going to be hastily raised levies. They're going to be disciplined, regular troops of the U.S. Army. Now, okay, we've made that decision. Now, who's going to lead this? Okay, Washington and Knox go through all the veteran officers from the Revolutionary War, all the generals. Well, this guy is too old. This guy is in poor health. This guy didn't really show the capacity for leadership. Baron von Steuben, he'd be great, but he's a foreigner. People on the frontier wouldn't trust him. So who do they end up with? And they're like, oh my God, not this guy. But that's who they ended up with, and that is Major General Anthony Wayne. And what's that? Mad Anthony, yes. Now, he got that nickname during the Revolution for two reasons. Number one, his vile temper. And number two, his sometimes rashness and impetuousness and aggressiveness in battle. And Washington was like, well, I don't know. I don't know if he's too much addicted to the bottle. He's liable to get into quarrels with the other officers. You know, he's rash, he's intemperate. I don't know if he has the judicious quality, if he's cautious enough. You're worried about him being cautious. You know, and I'm like, no, this is the guy you need. And probably his greatest feat during the Revolution was the storming of Stony Point in 1779. This was the British fortress on the Hudson River where he had his troops storm it at night with the bayonet, muskets unloaded. They overwhelmed the garrison and captured this fortress. This was a key location on the Hudson River. So the following year, Benedict Arnold turns coat and goes over to the British, and he has planned to turn West Point over to the British. Washington says over and over to Alexander Hamilton, who can we trust? Who can we trust? And then, of course, they realize who they can trust, and that's Anthony Wayne, and they put him in command of West Point at this crucial time. So at a lot of crucial points during the Revolutionary War, when Washington had to reach out to a combat commander who he knew would do the job, who did he go to? That would be Anthony Wayne. So he's appointed as the new commander of this new army. And this new army is totally reorganized. Again, who do we go back to for a model? Okay, we're going to call this force the Legion of the United States. Okay, it's the new version of the Roman legions. Okay, it's the Legion of the United States. Sometimes it's called the American Legion, but now we usually refer to it under just Wayne's Legion. And Wayne had said to Washington and Knox, look, you put me in command of the army, it's my army. I'm going to do what I want with it, subject only to your orders, the Secretary of War and the President. Say, okay, Tony, go ahead and take it. So what they did was reorganize into 4 sub-legions. And each sub-legion had a battalion of riflemen, several companies of light infantry who had specialized equipment and weapons that allowed them to move quickly and load their weapons more quickly. Then they had 2 battalions of line infantry, who are the shock troops, and then a troop of cavalry, light dragoons, and a battery of artillery. So each sub-legion was an independent fighting force on its own if need be. This is a very flexible organization, where each sub-legion can operate independently or as part of the main force. And this is an outstanding organization, as will be proven in the future. And they also had distinctive uniforms. At the beginning, light infantry caps, similar to this one, which if you took off the front plate are kind of like just a modern baseball cap. That's for the light infantry. And then eventually for the line infantry and the rest, the hats with the bearskin crest on them. Now the reason for that is the hats were terrible quality. Wayne said at the first rain they drooped down over the guys' faces like blankets. So he had a strong binding added to the edge, which helped with that, and then to waterproof the top and make the men look more martial and taller, he had the bearskin crest attached. So some people, I wear this thing and they say I look like one of those guys that the Wicked Witch of the West has in The Wizard of Oz, you know, yo. They said I look like those guys. So anyway, but that's the Legion. And here we have the riflemen. Oops, sorry. Let's go back. Here we have the riflemen armed with a folding pike or spear, the artillery, the light dragoons, a sergeant of the line infantry, an officer, and the light infantry. So that's the Legion. And hey, they start out near Pittsburgh at a camp called Legionville, training. This is the modern day reenacting group there. And what he does, he trains them a different way than the old shoulder-to-shoulder linear formations. Wayne has them spread out in skirmish formation, 6 to 8 feet apart, which is much more flexible, and they can move much faster that way. And he has them, response time becomes instantaneous. Once the drums signal the advance or the retreat or whatever, or facing, he has them respond extremely quickly because he realized the 2 keys to fighting Indians, mobility and firepower. Okay, don't allow you to spread out. Don't allow yourself to be surrounded. And another thing that he does is, again, we're copying Julius Caesar. Wayne is reading Caesar's commentaries. Who's he fighting? Who is Julius Caesar fighting? The Gauls. And who are the Gauls? Well, no, what kind of people are they?
Barbarians.
Barbarians. Okay, who is Wayne fighting? our modern version of the barbarians. So what he does is when the army moves, it only moves a short distance every day, maybe 12, 15 miles. Then they stop in the middle of the afternoon and they entrench and surround the camp with pickets and a stockade every night. This is exactly what Julius Caesar did. If the Indians attack at night, we can easily defend the camp and we're protected. So he uses all kinds of different new approaches to Indian fighting that are going to create success. Now, one of the big issues that Wayne faces is this guy right here, James Wilkinson. And in the immortal words of Bob Moulder, James Wilkinson made Benedict Arnold look like a choir boy. Now, this guy is a snake in the grass. He was a general brigadier during the Revolutionary War. He had a bad reputation. After the war, he goes out to Kentucky, becomes a bigwig, because through bribery, blackmail, and other routes, he gets permission for the Spanish to be the only American who can take cargoes down the Mississippi River to New Orleans from Kentucky. So he becomes very wealthy, a bigwig. When this war starts, he's appointed a brigadier general. He's basically second in command to Wayne. And he does everything he can to sabotage and undermine Anthony Wayne, his commanding officer. He writes continuously back to Washington and to Henry Knox saying Wayne is a buffoon, he's incompetent, he doesn't know what he's doing, he's corrupt, he's a drunkard, blah, 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 and asks for a court of inquiry against Wayne during this whole time. He's also a traitor. He's a secret agent in the pay of Spain. King Carlos has authorized payment to Wilkinson, and he's being paid by the Spanish to feed them classified information during this whole time. So think about it. The second in command of the United States Army is a traitor, feeding information to a possibly hostile other country. Wow. So, and we'll find out more about him. In 1793, it's very frustrating for Wayne because he has moved the Legion down the river, down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh to Cincinnati at Fort Washington. He's ready to go. He's got these guys trained, they're recruited up to strength, they're well equipped, they're well motivated, he's got them under control, he's ready to go, and all of a sudden the word comes from Philadelphia, no, hold off, because we've started peace negotiations with the Indians up by Detroit. Great. So all through the summer, the good campaigning season, Wayne is chafing at the bit down in Cincinnati, ready to go, ready to fight, and all these negotiations are going on, and they come to nothing because the British Indian Department officials at Detroit intervene. They tell the Indians, don't make peace with the Americans. We'll support you with guns, ammunition, food, everything you need. Just keep the war going. So that is what the decision that is made by the Indians. They don't make peace. All this time has totally been wasted. But Wayne does advance the troops, and they start north in the fall, and eventually they get up to the location of St. Clair's defeat in northwestern Ohio, and they build a fort there. They spend Christmas Day there laying on the frozen ground. They bury the bodies, and they build a new fort that they call Fort Recovery because they recovered this ground from the Indians. But another important thing that happens during that campaign is this force has joined them. Okay, now this is different. We talked about the militia. These guys are not militia. They're mounted volunteers. So they're there on a volunteer basis. These are picked men. They're well experienced in Indian warfare. They have their own horses, rifles, and equipment. Every Kentuckian goes insane at the sight of an Indian, is what was said. These guys are motivated to fight Indians because all Kentuckians hate Indians with an almost pathological hatred. Because of the warfare that has gone on down there for years, almost every person has had a relative killed by Indians, including their commander, General Charles Scott, who had 2 sons killed by Indians. Now, Charles Scott is another important character. He had been fighting Indians as far back as the French and Indian War, when he was under the command of Colonel George Washington in the Virginia Regiment. During the Revolutionary War, he became a major general. He was a key figure in several important battles. And after the war, he moves to Kentucky and becomes a very important military leader there too. He's very well trusted. He's a rough-hewn, whiskey-drinking, profane guy, and his men love him. Okay? So this is an important addition of about 1,000 Kentucky Mounted Volunteers to Wayne, even if the 93 campaign didn't accomplish that much. But here we go, it's 1794. Now the Army moved north. There was an area called the Grande Glaze, which is where the Glaze River flows into the Maumee River. That was a traditional site of Indian trading posts and councils. Wayne's army takes that over and builds another fort there that they call Fort Defiance. And Wayne says, neither the British, the Indians, nor all the devils in hell can take this fort. So that'll give you an idea of Anthony Wayne. Now this is great, but the Legion is at the end of a very long, tenuous, and vulnerable supply line. They're using pack horses, long trains of pack horses, to bring the ammunition and all the supplies up to the army. And what happens is, in August, an Indian army of about 1,500 warriors, the largest armed force gathered by the Indians during the war, sets out south, accompanied by officers of the British Indian Department and the Detroit militia, to attack and destroy Wayne's pack horse trains and totally disrupt the logistical support for the Legion. June 30th, they attack They attack Fort Recovery. They attack a pack horse train coming into the fort. They overwhelm the escort. They kill about 35 soldiers. Complete victory for the Indians. But then what do? They attempt to follow up survivors of the pack train escort and drivers who were fleeing into the fort. So they're trying to run up there and beat these guys who are running into the fort before the gate can be closed. The Indians don't make it. The gate closes. A whole hail of rifle and musket and artillery fire hits them from the fort, and including cannon from St. Clair's defeat that had been found by the Legion and mounted in the fort. This is a disaster for the Indians. As many as 45 warriors get killed. This is an unusually large number of casualties. In the aftermath of the attack, most of the Indians decide to go home. They have all the plunder they can carry and scalps. The Indian army dissolves without doing any further damage to Wayne's logistical support, to the disgust of the British Indian officials involved. Okay, we're moving north, advancing up the Maumee River toward Lake Erie, and the Indians decide to stand and fight and head off Wayne before he reaches and possibly attacks Detroit. They choose a tangle of brush and fallen trees where a tornado passed through several years before, the area known as the Fallen Timbers. And they're also within support of the British Fort Miamis, which had been built there in April. The Indians number about 1,200 from at least 8 different tribes, and Wayne has about 2,500, including the Legion and the Kentucky Mounted Volunteers. So on the morning of August 20th, 1794, Wayne's army moves north. And we encounter the Indians at what becomes known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The Indians attack first. They fire on the Kentucky Volunteers, who veer off into the floodplain by the Maumee River. The advance companies of Wayne's army fall back, firing as they go, as they've been trained to do, to gain time. The Legion quickly formed into a long skirmish line stretching for about 2.5 miles from the river, and then they advanced with fixed bayonets with muskets at the trail. They attacked so quickly, many of the Indians did not have time to reload their weapons before being bayoneted. The Indians are outflanked and outnumbered, and they retreat quickly as they can through the underbrush. This tangle of woods that they had formed as an ambush worked against them as they tried to get away and slowed them. So they're followed by the light dragoons who were slashing with their swords. The battle is over after about 90 minutes. This is a little outline of what happened. The Indian forces are here with the different tribes arrayed one by one. The Legion advances, the Kentucky Mounted Volunteers ride over here and outflank the Indians. The Indians retreat very quickly. They try to make a stand in a ravine led by Agushiaway, the famous Ottawa chief. But he gets shot through the face. He goes down, and the Indians retreat. And here come the light dragoons slashing with their sabers. So the tactics that Wayne used, mobility. Rush the Indians, don't give them time to reload, and then fire into the, so it's mobility, and then fire into their backs as they retreat, firepower. And he has overwhelmed them using the tactics that he trained the Legion in. Now we also have the Legion advance, and we have this British fort up here, Fort Miamis. Okay, what are we going to do about this? And the Legion had time to count its casualties. They amounted to 26 killed and 87 wounded. The Indian casualties were probably almost exactly the same, reported as 19 Indians and 6 Detroit militia killed. Now, Major Campbell, who was the British commander at this fort, the British had encroached on U.S. territory. They had built this fort along the Maumee River back in April of 1794, and they have a couple of hundred British troops inside this fort. This is what it looks like today. You can still see the ditch and the entrenchments. He closed the gate of the fort, and he refused to allow the British troops outside to support the Indians. Now, Wayne and Campbell exchanged angry letters over the next few days, with Wayne ordering Campbell to evacuate the fort, move his troops to Detroit. Campbell refused, and the Legion and the Kentucky Volunteers swarm all around the fort. They destroy hundreds of acres of Indian crops, and they burn the British trading post across the river. They devastate everything in the entire area. Campbell is unable to really do anything about this. Now, the result of this, the Indians are demoralized by their defeat at Fallen Timbers, and they're disgusted. Maybe this is even more effective. They're disgusted by the British failure to support them. So the Indians sign a peace treaty at Fort Greenville. Fort Greenville in August of 1795, ending hostilities along the northwest frontier and allowing white settlement in about 2/3 of Ohio to the south of the Greenville Treaty line. And within a year after that, the cities of Dayton, Columbus, and Cleveland were founded in Ohio. So there's a reason why Cleveland is up here along the Cuyahoga River. It's because it's below the Greenville Treaty line. So you can thank the Greenville Treaty for the existence of Cleveland, if you want. If you've ever been to Cleveland, maybe not so much. So because of Wayne's victory and diplomatic efforts by the United States, thank you for being here, Bob. Now, are you fact-checking me as I go along? I hope you are. Jay's treaty with Britain and the San Lorenzo Treaty with Spain ended a lot of the tension among the three countries. The British troops evacuated the northern posts at last. The Spanish evacuated their posts. within the United States when the boundary was surveyed. And the Legion, under Wayne's supervision, occupied these forts, finally, at last. This is 13 years after the Revolutionary War. The British have finally left their troops. They allowed their troops to evacuate American soil. But while on an inspection trip, Wayne fell ill at Fort Presque near Erie, Pennsylvania, and he died there on December 14th of 1796. Not sure what his problem was. The symptoms, what they described at that time, it's difficult to translate into a modern disease. He had terrible, intense pain in all of his joints and extremities, and he had terrible stomach pain. So I don't know what that was, but it killed him. Now the Legion was then reorganized into 4 normal infantry regiments and a battalion of artillery. So the legionary organization is gone. The cavalry is disbanded. The descendant unit today is the 3rd U.S. Infantry, the Old Guard, which is descended from the 1st Sub-Legion. The situation on the frontier is usually peaceful, but as millions of acres of Indian land are gradually taken over through treaties, and Indian population is forced into smaller and smaller enclaves, the tensions are building over the years. The legacy of Wayne's victory, the Indians, as Igucheway predicted at the Indian Council back in 1791, the Indians are losing more and more of their land through treaty and through occupation by the whites. And many of them are voluntarily moving across the Mississippi River even before the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So the Indians are disappearing from their former homeland, but, for instance, the Wyandots remain in northern Ohio around Sandusky until about 1845 or 46. They're still there. And they're seen as good neighbors. The other legacy of Wayne is really the birth of the modern United States Army. The traditions, the customs, the toughness and the determination of the U.S. Army are really legacies of Anthony Wayne and the veterans of the Legion of the United States. And many of the officers who served under him got their military training under Wayne, including Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, both served in the Legion. William Henry Harrison was his aide at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And our buddy here, Zebulon Pike, Pikes Peak, got his early military training as a volunteer under Anthony Wayne. So today, I'd like to pay tribute to those veterans as we approach Veterans Day. Forgotten war and forgotten veterans even in their own time. Now, in the aftermath of this, new actors take the stage. As time goes on, Tecumseh, the great Shawnee warrior, becomes more and more concerned about the loss of Indian land and starts to form an Indian confederation, again, in opposition to white encroachment on Indian lands. The opposite number, William Henry Harrison, appointed governor of Indiana by President Jefferson. And he is in charge of treaty negotiations through bribery, threats, intimidation, and other means. He is the one who's in charge of negotiating a lot of these treaties. So these two they know each other well. In a sense, they respect each other quite well. But along the frontier, these tensions are going to erupt in the future, and it's all going to come together in 1812. Okay, so maybe that could be the next, as Paul Harvey used to say, the next part of the story. Okay.
We have time for questions, so.
Anybody?
Yes.
Whatever happened to Wilkinson?
Wilkinson. Yeah, I knew that question was going to come up. So James Wilkinson, when Wayne died, who's on the spot and who becomes the commanding general of the United States Army? Wilkinson. Okay, and he's still a secret agent for Spain. And in the following years, he's involved in so many plots, counterplots, and conspiracies that it makes your head swim to keep track of all this. But eventually he becomes involved in the Aaron Burr conspiracy. He turns state's evidence on Burr when he realizes it's not going to work out. So he's a traitor to the traitor. And he moves after Louisiana Purchase, he moves the army down the Mississippi River near New Orleans, where the camp that he chooses is so unhealthy that more than 1,000 of the soldiers die. During the War of 1812, he's appointed to command one of the columns that are going to move up through Canada and capture Montreal. He's a total dismal failure. They have to retreat back to Sackett's Harbor, New York. So, as Congressman John Randolph of Virginia said, Wilkinson never won a battle or lost a court-martial. Because there's at least 3 court-martials and 4 courts of inquiry put on Wilkinson. They knew he was in league with Spain, but they could never prove it through documentation. So how he ends up, after Mexico becomes independent, he goes down to Mexico City and tries to negotiate a huge land grant in Texas around Galveston for he and his son. And he's also involved in all kinds of different schemes down there with the different army officers and government leaders. And he dies in Mexico City in 1825, fat and happy. So that's what happened to James Wilkinson. Any other questions? Yeah, yes, Bob. You have a correction for me?
You probably covered it, but didn't he at one point try to either separate Kentucky from
Yes.
the United States? Or
That was one of the plots. It's called the Spanish Conspiracy. And he was involved with the Spanish in trying to detach Kentucky and Tennessee from the United States and make them part of the Spanish colonies. So, and a lot of people were behind that.
all while he was a general, correct?
He was a general in the United States Army
Yeah.
while he was involved in this conspiracy, which was a traitorous conspiracy against the United States. So today we hear a lot of charges of treason, oh, he's a traitor, blah, blah, blah. But boy, this guy really was a traitor. He was disgusting.
He could have given Benedict Arnold lessons.
Oh, Benedict Arnold, like you said, Bob, was a choir boy compared to Wilkinson. He was just amazing. And he was in the clover all during this time. He was living a lavish lifestyle, and a lot of people really liked him. During the Wayne's campaigns, he was trying to get officers on his side in opposition to Wayne. He was trying to divide the army, and a lot of them didn't buy it and stayed loyal to Wayne. But he had William Clark to dinner and tried to get William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame to join up with his faction in the army. And Clark was like, no, dude, sorry, I'm staying out of this. So, yeah, he was a rat. No. Any other questions? Any answers? Okay, well, thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
I know you already have one, but
Challenge
add
coin.
that to your collection.
All right, I
We will
will.
definitely get you back.
Okay, sounds good.